Okay, so the next step in understanding our action potential story is to go through the steps of what happens during an action potential. So, just a really quick review of what the membrane looks like. So, if we have our membrane, we have these little phospholipid heads, and we have phosphate heads, and we have these little lipid tails that exist, and they stop anything but water and gases from flowing freely through this membrane. And so what's in the membrane is periodically you'll have little proteins that are put in there that are called channels. And they do exactly what they sound like. They allow for specific ions to flow in and out of the membrane. So I'm just going to finish illustrating this here. Okay, so here we have the outside of the cell, and here we have the inside of the cell. And so if you have different channels, and you have different concentrations of ions on the outside and the inside. So, for instance, on the outside there's potassium, and then there's a really big concentration of sodium. On the inside, it's the reverse. You have a high concentration of potassium and a low concentration of sodium. And say that we have these channels are selective. They can be selective for one specific ion. That means that only one type of ion can flow through them. And what happens when you open up the channel is, if you were to open this up here, you would have the free flow of potassium ions in and out of the cell. So that would happen when you open a potassium channel. Potassium can go in and out of the cell. Same thing holds for sodium. You open this up, sodium can go in, and sodium can go out. Now, the extent to which sodium wants to go in and out of the cell, or the extent to which potassium wants to go in and out of the cell, is basically dictated by, well, again, to keep it simple, all you have to know is what sodium wants to do is it wants to bring the cell to 60 millivolts. It's going to do whatever it has to do to get that cell to positive 60 millivolts. And potassium is going to do whatever it has to do to get that cell to negative 90 millivolts. So there's going to be the exchange of potassium ions whenever the potassium channel is open, and that exchange is going to be in favor of bringing the cell to negative 90 millivolts. And we'll go over the specifics of that in a second. And when you open the sodium channels, the exchange of sodium is always going to be in favor of bringing the cell to positive 60 millivolts. Okay, so that's all that happens when these different channels are open. These ions will act in a way to get the cell to one of these two, whichever their preferred potential is. Okay, so now we're just going to go through the history of the cell. So what happens is, we can make two axes here. We'll have one axis, which is voltage, and we'll have one that's time. So this will be voltage, and we'll just have this in millivolts because that's the unit we're concerned with. And this is time, and this will be, in milliseconds. It doesn't really matter. So time's going this way, volts are going this way. So we're just going to set a arbitrary threshold, and we'll get to what that threshold means in a second. We're going to set an arbitrary threshold here of, let's say it's negative 50 millivolts. This is the threshold for the action potential to start. And again, we'll get to what that means in a little bit. The neuron, let's just say that down here is negative 90 millivolts, the equilibrium potential for potassium, where potassium wants to go. And up here is 60 millivolts. So that's the equilibrium potential for sodium. That's where sodium wants to go. So I'm just going to call that equilibrium potential for sodium and equilibrium potential for potassium. So because neither ion is getting things their way in the resting membrane, because there is sodium and potassium on the inside of the cell. What basically happens is you have a resting membrane potential when the cell is inactive. And that resting membrane potential, we'll just say that it's about negative 65 millivolts. So it's not exactly at potassium's equilibrium potential, but it's closer to that than it is to sodium. So we're sitting down here. And then remember that what's happening with our neuron, once again, is we have our neuron with our little dendrites. And these dendrites, here's our axon, which terminates in a presynaptic terminal. Terrible, terrible illustration there. There we go. So what's happening is these dendrites are constantly getting chemical signals from other cells, like 1,000 neurons communicating with any given neuron. And those chemical signals are turning into graded potentials. So those are small increases in the voltage of the membrane. So say that, just for the sake of argument, say that you started with just a little chemical activity, like you can see here. Well, that would result in a little small graded potential like this, but then it would eventually go away. So then you say that you have a little bit more chemical activity. Well, this is going to be more of a graded potential. And then before this can diminish, you have even more chemical activity causing even more excitatory activity. What that's going to do is that is going to depolarize the cell, make it more positive, until eventually it hits this threshold. So the activity of all these chemicals causing excitatory signals will push the cell to a certain threshold. And when that cell hits the threshold, that's when stuff gets real. So what is specifically very interesting about this, well, to be perfectly honest, it's an arbitrary threshold that I'm setting here. It could be negative 50 millivolts. It could be something different in a different neuron if you wanted it to be, but we're just going to call it negative 50 millivolts. What's happening at this threshold is the neuron possesses a number of voltage-gated sodium channels. So remember we talked about the fact that we have a little membrane, there are different channels, there's potassium channels, and there's sodium channels. So what happens at this specific threshold is a very specific kind of sodium channel opens up, and it's a voltage-gated sodium channel. And we call it voltage-gated because it is the gating of the channel, the opening of the channel, is determined by the voltage of the neuron. And this is because there is a small little positive subunit of this receptor which responds to the inside of the cell becoming more positive by just sort of causing a conformational change in the receptor itself, so it opens it up. But all you have to really know is that these voltage-gated sodium channels, when they detect that there's a positive charge on the inside of the cell, they will open up. And because it is just voltage-gated sodium channels that are opening up, sodium is able to act in whatever way it wants. And how does sodium act? Sodium acts in such a way to bring the cell to positive 60 millivolts. So since sodium carries a positive what's going to happen is when these channels open, basically all the sodium on the outside is going to be booking it to the inside of the cell. It's all going to flow in, and it's going to carry all of its positive charges, and it's going to try and make the inside of the cell get up to positive 60 millivolts. So there's going to be a huge positive increase in the cell's membrane, a huge depolarization. And this is all from sodium going into the cell. So we call that sodium influx. All right. But these channels don't stay open forever. Eventually they're going to close. So here, let me give myself a little bit more space to draw here. So these channels Again, originally we have our membrane, and we have potassium channels, and then we have sodium channels. And when we hit negative 50 millivolts, then the sodium channels will open up, and they will allow sodium to do whatever it wants. So it'll open up, and sodium, because it does whatever it wants, is going to flow inside the cell to try and bring it up to positive 60 millivolts. So it flows into the cell, it increases the the voltage of the membrane, and then eventually, before the cell can actually get to 60 millivolts, when it's like maybe around 30 or so, these channels will inactivate. They will close. It'll make it impossible for any more sodium to flow in. These channels will turn off before sodium can achieve its dream of reaching positive 60 millivolts. And so what happens is when those channels inactivate, about here, we're just going to call this the inactivation period right here, there's going to still be a slight increase, just a residual increase, but there are other channels that are called voltage-gated potassium channels that are then going to open. And so those voltage-gated potassium channels open because of similar properties. They detect an electrical charge, there's a conformational change, and then they open up. They're gated, they open because of voltage. So while these sodium channels are inactivated, these potassium channels become activated. And so now, we'll say the cell is sitting at 30 millivolts from the influx of sodium. Now potassium has free reign to do whatever it wants. And it says, whoa, this cell is way too positive because I, being potassium, want to keep the cell at negative 90 millivolts. So 30 millivolts is completely unacceptable. So what we have to do is the potassium ions of this cell, have to act in such a way to bring the membrane down to negative 90 millivolts, or at least we can try. So what that involves is all that potassium on the inside, which carries a positive charge, wants to go out. It has to leave. It has to exit the inside of the cell because the cell is way more positive than it wants it to be. So the potassium has to move out in order to bring the voltage of the neuron's membrane down. So what's happening during this falling phase, when only the potassium channels are open and potassium is approaching its ideal state of negative 90 millivolts, is you are having an efflux, an exiting of potassium. So again, when we open the voltage-gated sodium channels, sodium gets to do what it wants, and so it makes the cell get as close to positive 60 millivolts as it can. It doesn't get all the way there. The channels inactivate right about here, and then potassium channels open, and then potassium wants to bring the cell back to negative 90 millivolts, and so potassium is going to flow outside of the cell because it carries a positive charge, and it's going to flow outside of the cell to make the cell more negative. And eventually that's going to get to about here, and then a little bit after it hits resting membrane potential, those channels are going to inactivate themselves. They are also going to close, so that there's no more conduction. And at this point, the sodium channels are back open for business. So they're a-okay at this point. So now that we've had all this potassium efflux and potassium has its time to shine, potassium channels are closed, but the sodium channels are back open. And so what happens is, there's actually a little bit of a lag between getting to the resting membrane potential, which is about here, and the channels actually closing. So I drew this a little bit wrong here, so I'm just going to try and redraw it. So there's a little bit of a lag between hitting resting membrane potential, which we'll call right here, and the channels actually closing. So they'll close at about here. So what happens is, for a brief period of time, the voltage of the cell is going to become slightly more negative than even resting membrane potential. And this is because there's just a residual effect of potassium getting its way, and it wants the cell to not, it doesn't want the cell to be negative 65 millivolts, it wants it to be negative 90 millivolts. So when you've given potassium just a little bit of leeway, it's going to make the cell even a little bit more negative than it would be otherwise. But eventually, it'll even out, and you'll get back to the resting membrane potential. So this is what we call an action potential. And it's called this because it is a potential that is very, very big, and it is used to communicate information that results in basically neural activity at the axon terminal. So the reason that this action potential is different from a graded potential is that graded potentials are much simpler. It's just caused, it responds to chemical signals that are coming in, and it'll cause a brief little increase in the voltage of the membrane, or it can cause a little bit more, and all of that depends just on, whatever chemicals are being activated and the flow of ions into the cell. So all that's pretty straightforward. All this business with the voltage-gated channels that are causing a signal to act in a very stereotyped and specific way, which is much more dramatic than just any one little graded potential. This makes an action potential closer to a gunshot than, I don't know what you would call this, just a whisper or talking. So graded potentials can exist on a continuum, but an action potential exists as a very uniform and stereotyped phenomenon where there's just a tremendous depolarization followed by a brief hyperpolarization. The cell becomes a little bit more negative than it would otherwise, and then eventually arrives back at the resting membrane potential. And the purpose of this being so dramatic is because when an action potential fires, it's not an accident. It is because of the summed activity of a whole bunch of chemical messengers that have worked really hard to bring a positive charge down to the axon hillock, where all of these voltage-gated sodium channels are. So when the cell tallies all the votes for, yes, I'd like to fire this particular neuron, and it arrives at the conclusion that it says, okay, we're positive enough, we've reached the threshold that we're going to fire the action potential, it has to be a dramatic and a very dramatic change that's affected by completely different mechanisms than just these chemicals binding to the receptors here. It's affected by changes in these voltage-gated channels that cause everything to occur in a very dramatic and a very similar way across the axon. So when this is happening, you're not going to see any changes. It's not going to be a bigger or a smaller action potential. Every action potential is going to be roughly the same size. The difference, if anything, is the frequency with which the action potentials fire. So if you have a lot of stimulation, you can have a lot of gunshots indicating, okay, activity, 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 and all those will propagate down the axon as action potentials. But they aren't going to change in size, because if you remember, the size of these action potentials is determined by these receptors inactivating. It has nothing to do with the stimulus itself. It's already tallied the votes of the stimulus, and it's determined that it's going to send a signal down the axon. And so now it's just using a completely different mechanism to send a very large signal that's communicated with the change in the membrane voltage here. So again, just to go over all the stages one more time, you're just going to draw it like this. We have voltage and we have time. So again, we're going to set a threshold here, and we're going to have our resting membrane potential here, so it sits here. Graded potentials come into the cell, graded potentials, a lot of activity. Okay, it's positive, it's positive, it's positive, and we've hit threshold. We've hit threshold, voltage-gated sodium channels open. Voltage sodium channels open. That'll cause a tremendous depolarization of the membrane because sodium is trying to bring it to negative 60 millivolts. It never gets there, or to positive 60 millivolts. It never gets there, it gets to positive 30 millivolts. Voltage-gated channels inactivate. Voltage-gated potassium channels then open. I said voltage-gated channels inactivate. Voltage-gated sodium channels inactivate here. Voltage-gated potassium channels open. Potassium says, okay, we need to bring this down to negative 90 millivolts. Goes down, 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 and this is caused by, I'll just put the thing here, voltage-gated potassium channels. And so as this goes down, here we have potassium flowing outside of the cell. And here we had sodium flowing inside the cell. And so this goes down, 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 tries to get to negative 90 millivolts, doesn't quite get there. The voltage-gated potassium channels inactivate, and then it will return to the resting membrane potential. So through potassium influx and through sodium influx and then potassium efflux, we have a massive increase and then a massive decrease in the voltage of the neuron's membrane. And that massive increase and that massive decrease is what we call an action potential. And action potentials, they will all look the same. They will all all have the same shape. They all have the same amplitude. They're all the same size. The only difference between them, the only difference that action potentials will exhibit with regards to communicating the properties of a stimulus is how many there are. So more action potentials indicate a more intense stimulus, but that's it. So those are all the steps. And if you think of it just in terms of during the rising phase here, where you have sodium influx, all that is you've given sodium the opportunity to do what it wants, and it'll take the cell up to positive 60 millivolts. During the efflux phase here, all you've done is you've given potassium the opportunity to do what it wants, and it wants to bring the cell down to negative 90. So the increase and the decrease, all of that is accomplished just because these ions are being given the opportunity to do what they want for a brief period of time. And when they're given that opportunity, the cell first becomes very positive and then becomes very negative. And the activity of the ions themselves are just in accordance with whether they want to either be adding positive charges, which they do during the rising phase, that's why you'd have an influx, or taking away positive charges, which is why you'd have an efflux in the falling phase. So that's really all there is to it. That's how an action potential works. And so in the final video presentation, I'm going to describe what happens with an action potential as it goes down the membrane, and why we care about it, and what it actually ends up doing in the cell.